How's it going, guys? Lee here. Now today I wanted to go through and talk about Australia's fastest growing stock, and that is ISX, or also known as I Sign This. Now if you guys aren't aware of the company, it's a small company, relatively small, in Australia that's made a massive surge in 2019 and had an increase of over 800% in terms of growth. The company was first founded in Australia in 1996 and it was based in Melbourne. It was only listed a few years ago and had the best performing IPO in 2015 and the highest growing share in 2019 to date. The goal of iSign is to basically allow people to do remote self-identification, which in Australia and many other countries is based on a 100-point system. Generally, for most people, this will include the use of your passport and an ID. In many cases, your driver's license. Now, the whole point of this remote self-identification is to allow companies and businesses like gambling and any institution where there are a lot of transactions going on in different locations, and generally when they're online, for those individuals to identify themselves through the system, allowing the gambling institution or whatever business to fulfill their requirements of the regulators in identifying the individuals using the services so then they can use them freely. Now in 2015, the CEO of I Sign This sat down for an interview where he mentioned that the main use of the service at that given time was for gambling services like casinos, your sports bets, all that kind of stuff, and then also for trading services, whether it's in equities, CFDs. Yes, CFDs. So they were using it for those kind of services, and high regulation is all over those services, and understandably so. You know, you're managing and dealing with a lot of people's monies, and some of these things can, on the trading end could be high levels of leverage, and on the gambling end it could be high levels, well, you could have leverage there as well. But there's addiction and stuff that comes along with that as well. So I understand that there's regulation in those places for that. So I Sign This is essentially coming in there to, I guess, fulfill one of the portions or the bigger parts of the regulation and making sure people are identified to reduce fraud. Now, to provide a bit more context around the business and the service, I actually want to look back at how people used to identify themselves, and I guess still do to this day, right? If we look back only a couple years ago, people would have to go for a face-to-face interview or have their documents certified, witnessed by, a justice of the peace or a lawyer or somebody like that, and then posted in, and then it had to be processed, which was very, very, very slow. We then eventually moved on to data brokering services where it would generate a couple of questions and then you would put in your answers, like, the most common one being, what's your mother's maiden names, what's the first street you lived on, your favorite subject in high school. God. All those kind of things, where we were able to input an answer for that. Once we logged in, they'd ask you the question and then you go about and answer that. Now you'd see that mainly in government sites, and it generally does work, because sometimes I forget even my answers that I put in for that. But in saying that, that form of data brokering was so susceptible to hacking, with breaches of privacy. There was also phishing for information to sell off other people's identities so that other people can use it for fraudulent acts. Now that type of data brokering is what they call collecting static data, because the data just stays, it doesn't really move, and all the responses have a fixed response. So ISX tries to do the opposite of this, or fight this, and gets you as the financial individual, of which there's like 3 billion of us in the world who uses some form of MasterCard, Visa, some kind of debit card or a credit card that's been, identified within the institution that's handed it over to you. Because in order for us to obtain these cards, we need to be pre-approved by the banks, who have to, identify us to a certain regulatory level. This process is most commonly known as KYC, or Know Your Customer, where a business will generally verify your identification, which is often through the old school 100-point system. But anyways, they identify you as an individual before providing their services. And so what ISX does is they understand that the checks have already been done in the first place with the institutions. So they're basically just going to leverage that KYC process to further identify you in 3 simple steps. So the first part of the step is ISX will secretly link info to your bank and ask for you to retrieve it, thus links your KYC provider. Now this is normally done when you make one purchase, let's say $100, and that purchase, instead of paying one lump sum of $100, is broken into $30 and $70 equals $100. So then as you go through the transaction to complete it for your item that you bought for $100, then you'd go online and put in the two sums, so 50-50, so whatever the number they give you. It won't be 50-50, that's too simple. And then the second part of that is then you upload your proof of residency. And the third part is that they scan your ID and run through criminal and watch list checks to basically make sure you're not fraudulent. And then after all that, you've been onboarded onto the service, or you've got the product, you're just onboarded. So now that's the process of onboarding you. Now, how do they actually put these and use these services with other businesses to service them? Now, in a transaction, ISX uses their e-money service. So what they'll do is first they'll take your money from you so that you're committed to the purchase. So after they've taken your money, held onto it through their e-money service, they then do all the checks that we've just talked about before. So then after the checks, they forward the money and all that information over to the business which you're making the transaction through. Now the business is happy with that because they've now got their money for their service or the product that they're providing, and they've got all the KYC checks and balances and all the process behind them. So then the regulators are happy. And so you can see how this can be quite useful, right? Like, let's think about it. Let's pretend you're somebody who's about to do some sports betting and you're watching the rugby and you're going, oh, I think, the Melbourne Storms are going to win in the next game, and you've never signed up for a service before. You quickly go in. Instead of doing all the checks and stuff that you would normally have to do in the old-fashioned way, you can just put in the sums and amounts, do the whole KYC check through ISX, and then make your betting within the matter of 3 minutes or so. So that's a much quicker way of onboarding somebody and meeting all the regulatory requirements to get them in and using your services, which is way better than any form of cumbersome service before. Like, even if you just use the 100-point check system, like, you would have to run around, grab your passport, and then you'd have to run around and then grab your driver's license, punch in all the numbers and do all of that kind of stuff when your bank's already verified that. So I think the system is really well done, and there's definitely a purpose for the system, and it just works. So now we have a service that's able to remotely identify people on a global scale. It allows online businesses to scale so much harder and do things online, take on more customers, all whilst complying with the regulatory requirements in their given field. Now, although ISX isn't a very common name in Australia, just because their services haven't really picked up, it's actually picked up a fair bit over in the EU. And over in the EU, it's actually been given the thumbs up by a few regulators and government bodies over there in the financial area. And so with this unique offering that ISX provides, you can kind of see why the share price has gone up, but it takes a lot more than a great idea for a share price to go up. The company actually has continued to grow as its gross processing transaction volume has increased. But I don't believe that this is the only reason for its growth within the year of 2019. I believe the share price has been pumped up by speculators who can come on through and, listening and understanding the processes of the business itself, like I've just mentioned to you guys, can see that it's going to be a booming area as we go towards that cashless phase in society. And touching on a cashless society, and if we're looking on a broader trend, setting scenario in the ASX fintech space, we have Afterpay, we have ZipPay, we have Splitter, and a bunch of other new ones that have come on board that I can't even name. There's too many of them. But with all these new formats in which you can pay, and the buy now, pay later space being accepted globally on a global scale, like if you look at Afterpay, they've succeeded over in the US, they've succeeded over in the UK, and they've definitely dominated Australia. And not only with the buy now, pay later space, but with the emergence of neobanks and banks becoming more online just to reduce overheads and increase profits, you can see how ISX becomes a really great value proposition and why people are starting to speculate and seeing its integration into these little banks and institutions. Because what ISX is doing is basically breaking down the barriers to entry for many of these new banks to come on through, or many of these new platforms to come on through, for businesses with microtransactions to thrive, with a lot more people flowing into the markets or into the spaces that they're going to, like gambling and whatnot as well. And like I mentioned before, even traditional banks, I'm pretty sure, like 100% sure, that they'll be moving more and more towards an online space. Yes, there'll be a couple of ATMs around, but once you become a cashless society, you won't really need branches and ATMs. You might have a few in the main cities, but regional areas, probably not worth it. And because there's such little growth for the finance sector in Australia, just because our population isn't that big and it's not seeming to grow unless we allow migration to come through, which I don't think is going to be happening anytime soon, there's just very little space for growth. And so for these banks to pump up their profits, it's easier to just reduce the operating cost, make it an online model, less branches, less employees, with the support of ISX or whatever the equivalent is, to do all their online boarding, it's just gonna be so much easier. And if I went any longer, this video will become a tangent about the whole banking system and how that might all work. And maybe that becomes a topic for another video, you know, talking about banking stocks, finance stocks, because I do have shares in the finance space, much like I have shares in ISX. And with that, guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Give a like, subscribe, make sure you follow my new Instagram page because I'll be posting up motivational and business kind of topics. But apart from that, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!